Living under my father's roof felt like being trapped in a world ruled by fear and control. He was emotionally abusive, obsessed with religious authority, and determined to micromanage every aspect of our lives. My siblings and I grew up isolated, taught to fear the police and child protective services to the point that we didn't realize how deeply abnormal our lives were. My father's word was law, and his power over us seemed unshakable. As I got older and left for college, I began to see the cracks in the facade. My little brother, still living at home, came out as gay when he was 15. At first, he kept it hidden from my father, but the truth eventually came out. My father's response was violent and hateful. He started beating my brother in secret. My brother, fed up and scared, finally threatened to tell our mother. That's when my father crossed an even bigger line. Instead of taking accountability, he kicked my brother out of the house. A scared, vulnerable teenager suddenly found himself homeless. My mother was horrified when she found out. She tried to reason with my father, but instead of listening, he turned violent toward her, too. He began hitting her in addition to his usual emotional abuse. It was the breaking point for all of us. I helped my mom leave, ensuring she was safe, and my brother went to stay with friends. Divorce proceedings started not long after, but the process was anything but straightforward. My father's influence extended to our small town's local police, many of whom were his friends. None of us felt safe turning to the authorities. Ultimately, he agreed to a no-fault divorce, and we all tried to move forward. But the damage he left behind lingered like a scar. Then, as my mom was packing her things to leave the house, she made a discovery that changed everything: his military discharge papers. For my entire life, my father had told anyone who'd listen that he was a decorated Special Forces veteran. He claimed to have been awarded both a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, though he conveniently insisted they'd been destroyed in a house fire along with all his other military records. He wore this supposed identity like armor, using it to build his reputation in the community as a selfless, godly man who'd sacrificed for his country. But those papers told a very different story. According to the documents, he hadn't been a war hero. He'd served 4 years in the motor pool, working on vehicles, and had been discharged with an other-than-honorable status. His entire persona was built on a lie. At the time, my mom chose to stay silent. She didn't want to be seen as a vindictive ex-wife or give him ammunition to use against her in their already messy divorce. But she kept the papers tucked away, waiting for the right moment. Years later, over a glass of wine, she finally told me about what she'd found. By then, my father had moved out of state and started a new life with a militia group, spinning more lies about his past to bolster his image. As she spoke, I realized we had an opportunity to do something we'd never been able to before: strike back. The plan began to take shape that night. Slowly, methodically, we started working on a way to expose the truth about the man who had made our lives hell. The plan was simple in concept but required precision to pull off. My mom and I decided to expose the truth about my father's lies in a way that would leave no doubt about who he truly was. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about stripping away the facade he had used to hurt so many people. First, we gathered intelligence. We combed through social media, looking for his current connections. Over several weeks, we made a list of his former and current employers, extended family, key friends, and even his new church. My mom reached out to family members who had long since distanced themselves from him, while I enlisted my college friends from across the country. With everyone on board, we started to coordinate. The timing had to be perfect, and we settled on Veterans Day, a day he always used to brag about his service. Each of us purchased a Veterans Day card. Inside, we included a photocopy of his discharge papers, making sure the section detailing his other-than-honorable discharge was front and center. The cards were carefully handwritten, with messages that cut straight to the point: stolen valor, motor pool, not special forces, pretender. We attached the copies of the discharge papers and sealed the envelopes, marking the return address as his current church. The goal was to make it look like the cards came from people within his new community, people who had discovered the truth about him. On the designated day, all the cards were mailed from major cities across the country, and even abroad: Atlanta, Orlando, Washington, D.C., New York, St. Louis, Kansas City, Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles, Houston, Ontario, London, Edinburgh. Our network spread far and wide. Within days, the cards would start flooding his mailbox, as well as the mailboxes of his employers, church leaders, and anyone else he'd built his reputation on lies with. The fallout was immediate. My mom was inundated with calls and emails from people who had been duped by my father's stories. Former friends and community members expressed shock, disbelief, and even apologies for not believing her or my brother when they had told the truth about his abuse. Messages poured in from people saying, "I had no idea, and I can't believe he lied about that." Then there were the calls from his current supporters. My mom received nasty messages accusing her of orchestrating the entire thing, calling her a liar and far worse. But she had anticipated this and forwarded every threatening email and voicemail to her lawyer. The biggest reaction came from my father himself. He sent my mom a furious email full of veiled threats, promising retribution if he ever found out she was behind this. She forwarded that to her lawyer, too. He had no idea how far and wide the truth had already spread or how little control he had left over the narrative. Meanwhile, my brother, who had no idea we were behind any of this, received an unexpected call from our old pastor. The pastor apologized for how the church had treated him, admitting that they had believed my father's lies. It was a small step toward healing for my brother, even though he didn't know the full story. For years, my father had built his life on deceit and manipulation, but now his reputation was crumbling. Slowly, the truth was catching up with him, and there was no way for him to undo the damage. As Veterans Day passed, the cards began to land in mailboxes across the country and beyond. The fallout was even more dramatic than we had imagined. In his local community, people started talking. The members of his new church, the very people he'd manipulated into believing he was a godly, decorated war hero, began to question everything. His employer, who had hired him under the assumption he was a Special Forces veteran with a Purple Heart, was reportedly furious. Even within his militia, whispers of stolen valor began to circulate. The anger wasn't just local. Calls started coming in from extended family members who had once idolized him. They wanted answers, demanding to know why he'd lied about something as sacred as military service. For a man like my father, whose entire identity was wrapped up in his fabricated heroism, this was a public unmasking on a devastating scale. Every card, every photocopy of that discharge paper was another crack in the carefully constructed image he'd used to manipulate and control others for decades. And then he snapped. My mom received an email that could only be described as a tantrum in writing. It was packed with threats and accusations, full of rage and desperation. He claimed she had ruined his life, swore that she would pay for what she'd done, and implied that he would take action if he ever found proof she was responsible. She forwarded the email to her lawyer, without a second thought. His threats were empty, they always had been, but having them documented added another layer of protection for her. Meanwhile, I kept an ear to the ground through our network of participants. The people who had mailed cards from across the globe reported similar reactions from those who'd received them. Employers cutting ties. Former friends expressing shock. Even members of the militia distancing themselves from him, unwilling to be associated with a man whose entire military career had been a lie. The most unexpected consequence came from our hometown. Out of nowhere, people who had once judged my mom harshly for leaving him began to change their tune. For years, she had been painted as the villain in the divorce, the woman who had walked away from a godly man. But now, with the truth about his character laid bare, she was receiving apologies. People saw her not as the villain, but as the survivor of an abusive marriage who had risen above it all. The most satisfying moment came when my brother, still unaware of our involvement, told me about the call he received from our old pastor. This was the same pastor who had sided with my father during the divorce, kicking my brother out of the church after he came out. Now, the pastor was apologizing, saying he regretted believing my father's lies and asking for forgiveness. It wasn't just about the lies being exposed, it was about reclaiming our dignity. My father's reputation, once his greatest weapon, had been shattered. The people he'd manipulated into his orbit were seeing him for who he truly was, a fraud. In the end, the cards did more than expose my father's lies. They shifted the narrative he'd built for decades. For once, he couldn't control the story. The community, family, and friends he'd deceived finally saw him for the abusive, manipulative man he truly was. For my mom, this was more than revenge, it was vindication. She no longer had to carry the weight of being the villain who had left her godly husband. People saw her as the strong, resilient survivor she always had been. For my brother, even though he didn't know the full extent of what we'd done, it meant receiving long overdue apologies from people who had turned their backs on him during his most vulnerable moments. As for me, I slept better knowing that justice had been served in our own way. My father's reputation was in tatters, and he had no one to blame but himself. His threats carried no weight anymore. The damage was done, and there was no repairing it. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that revenge is best served cold, but it's also most effective when it's rooted in truth. Lies may carry someone for a while, but eventually, the weight of them becomes too much to bear. If you've faced injustice at the hands of someone manipulative, don't underestimate the power of patience and strategy. Truth, in the end, is a powerful weapon. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more tales of resilience and justice.